and Apple TV 1. So anyway, as I said, their lifetime was what I like to think of as the Second American Revolution, because in the first, in 1776, all men were created equal, but from 1830 to 1865, demands for all people to be created equal emerged. In the case of the Cherokee, of course, things didn't go that well. Cherokee removal happened, but there was protest in New England against Cherokee removal, and in part, the way that political activism developed in the 1830s was that white New Englanders protested Cherokee removal in the ways that the Cherokee were treated by Andrew Jackson, and when the removal happened anyway, they turned their organizing efforts to other sites, such as anti-slavery and women's rights. The Cherokee removal activism had a lot to do with making petitions, so women started making petitions as their form of activism. Emerson actually wrote a letter to Martin Van Buren in which he said, hey, you can't do this to the Cherokee. They are a civilized people. They have their own constitution. They have their own written language. They have their own newspapers that actually were bilingual. But Martin Van Buren did not listen to Emerson, although Emerson did visit the White House when Lincoln was president much later. So Emerson even was somewhat involved in that issue and activism, which led to more activism for women's rights and for anti-slavery among white New Englanders. This activism for women's rights continued in New York State, and to a certain extent, the women's rights activists like Elizabeth Cady Stanton were also interested in anti-slavery until black men got the vote in 1865, and then Elizabeth Cady Stanton became so angry with everything in the world that she started acting like a racist because she didn't get the vote too. So you can kind of understand her frustration. But many of the issues that we face today were also really powerful issues in the 1830 to 1865 time period. If we think about Me Too and Black Lives Matter and the whole immigration debate, 1845, when the United States annexed Mexico and the Mexican War took place, is when California became part of the United States and Texas and, this huge expansion. So all of those people who were indigenous, many of them had to leave as well, but they became non-citizens. Mexico, people who were Mexican because Mexico extended into the United States, suddenly had no citizenship if they stayed in their ancestral homelands. So that's really where the immigration crisis started, with the United States expanding and annexing, and even considering annexing Cuba in the 1850s. But when these expansions happened, it was explicitly a manifest destiny for white people. It wasn't for the indigenous or the Mexican people. So the first primary document that we have in the Heath 1800 intro PDF that I stole is about annexation. It's not written by an activist. It's written by the contemporary equivalent of the alt-right. Although I would have to say that the U.S. Magazine and Democratic Review, although it was pro-slavery, anti-women's rights, and pro-annexation and expansion, was perhaps more of a majority and a more accepted opinion to everyone in the 1840s and 1850s than Fox News is today. But it's fascinating when you see what they say. California will probably next fall away from the loose adhesion which in such a country as Mexico holds a remote province and a slight equivocal kind of dependence on the metropolis. Imbecile and distracted, Mexico can never can exert any real government authority over such a country. So I think that Trump read this. he calls people similar names, right? Hello, welcome to 1847 or 2018. So there is one issue that we see in the primary documents. And I will connect this to the Gothic in just a minute, and you'll see a better connection to the Gothic or the American ghost story and the haunting of America with this example from Elizabeth Cady Stanton. So although we know of Elizabeth Cady Stanton as one of the founders of the first women's rights movement and an anti-slavery activist, one of her writings here is actually about the fire and brimstone preaching of her, I believe, Congregational church. So when you think about how she writes, she published this in 1897, but she's reflecting back on the 1830s and on her youth. You can see a little influence of Hawthorne. Dr. Finney's appearance in the pulpit on these memorable occasions is indelibly impressed on my mind. I can see him now, his great eyes rolling around the congregation and his arms flying about in the air like those of a windmill. One evening he described hell and the devil and the long procession of sinners being swept down the rapids, about to make the awful plunge into the burning depths of liquid fire below. Little Jonathan Edwards imagery that this preacher is borrowing too. And the rejoicing hosts in the inferno coming up to meet them with shouts of devils echoing through the vaulted arches. He suddenly halted, and pointing his index finger at the supposed procession, he claimed, "There, do you not see them?" And I think this actually happens in a Flannery O'Connor story too, which is about pigs primarily. Have you ever read the story? You know what I'm talking about? Oh, no, I'm thinking of Flannery O'Connor, who is a Southern woman writer. I only realized just now that this happens in the Saints Come Marching In. That might even be the title of the story. I'd have to see if I can look it up to make the connection. So Flannery O'Connor writes about Southern life and is an important figure in Southern women's rights. So it's interesting that I think she's touching on 80 years and more here. I would have to go back and double check. So forgive me for the tangent. But the interconnection of American literature with Elizabeth Cady Stanton borrowing from Hawthorne, and possibly in the early 20th century Flannery O'Connor borrowing from Elizabeth Cady Stanton, becomes very intricately interwoven. So I was wrought up to such a pitch that I actually jumped up and gazed in the direction to which he pointed, while the picture glowed before my eyes and remained with me for months afterward. I cannot forbear saying that, although high respect is due to the intellectual, moral, and spiritual gifts of the venerable ex-president of Oberlin College, who was the preacher, such preaching worked incalculable harm to the very souls he sought to save. Fear of judgment seized my soul. Visions of the lost haunted my dreams. Mental anguish prostrated my health. Dethronement of my reason was apprehended by friends. But he was sincere, so peace to his ashes. Returning home, I often at night roused my father from his slumbers to pray for me, lest I should be cast in the bottomless pit before morning. So, do you have any thoughts about about Elizabeth Cady Stanton's tone in that piece? Do you think she's sincere? Do you think she is hyperbolic, sarcastic?
I don't know how sincere she's being, but it's definitely weird that it's like, yeah, essentially kind of, ruined my life because it plagued me with all this doubt and worry.
Right.
But I guess he meant well, so.
Yeah, no
She's
bad.
definitely playing with the idea that, like, I don't really respect him at all. He's a piece of shit. But,
It's irreverent, yeah. And because she says, and I even looked in that direction, as though looking back and saying, this was quite a show, and it clearly wasn't there. So when we read Ligeia, and particularly Ligeia, next week with Poe, you'll see almost similar language in how the narrator, and again, it's because Stanton is borrowing from Poe. So Stanton borrows from Poe and from Hawthorne, but to what extent did Poe and Hawthorne absorb the political climate they were writing in? it's an anti-slavery moment. It's a women's rights moment. Hawthorne did oppose the annexation of Mexico, in large part probably because all of his friends did. So we also have the Declaration of the Anti-Slavery Convention. And my point in dragging up these old documents and these primary documents is to give you an idea of what was going on politically and historically in Emerson, Hawthorne, and Poe's lifetime. Because I have a theory that they did absorb what was going on around them and irreverently made it into a horror story. You know, women's power is a horror story. The idea of women being equal to men is pretty scary. Hawthorne idealized women on a pedestal, and his wife was practically an invalid because they rubbed mercury on their gums when they were babies in the 10s and 20s when they were teething, because it made their gums didn't hurt and they stopped crying. It also destroyed their central nervous system. So his wife was a painter, and she was a very smart woman, and her sisters were even smarter, but she had such terrible migraines because her nervous system was damaged that she was very much a fragile, not submissive, but a very fragile and very feminine kind of wife. And they had a very passionate and intimate relationship. So definitely a marriage of not like just an arranged marriage, not like a marriage of convenience or for social status, but they were, I think, deeply in love. So Hawthorne's take on women's rights might be filtered into Hawthorne's stories. And the power of race science that we saw somewhat in Notes on Virginia, with the Count de Buffon saying that people in the Americas are degenerate, essentially, because it's an inferior place and not civilized, and Thomas Jefferson writing back saying, our goats are just as big and our bisons have big balls, or whatever crazy argument he made, and Native Americans aren't hairy because they pluck their hair. That's pretty much the logic of scientific racism right there, continued to grow into a way to justify slavery. So, and we see even a little bit of the roots of that in Jefferson's writing. It became much more predominant, and there was a famous eugenicist, Josiah Nott, and many, many other contemporaries who wrote about the difference between civilizations. And by civilizations, he meant different European civilizations, and then Africa, India, China, South America. He didn't have, there was like 20 categories for Europe and big clumps of brown people everywhere else in the way that Josiah Nott organized the world. So he's talked specifically about the brain of the Negro. There was a pseudoscience called craniology, in which people actually got their heads measured. If you've heard of Sarah Bartman, who was known as the Hottentot Venus, sexologists who were also race scientists measured her buttocks and her breasts and her other genitalia to make arguments about her sexuality. She was a South African woman who traveled around Europe in these demonstrations, but also was the subject of lectures at the Sorbonne and the University of London and for the London Anthropological Society. So very highly established institutions of higher learning and science were invested in these crazy race science arguments. So Josiah Nott is a great example of it, and perhaps one of the most infamous. The brain of the Negro, as I have stated, is, according to positive measurements, smaller than the Caucasian by a full tenth, and this deficiency exists particularly in the anterior portion of the brain, which is known to be the seat of the higher faculties. History and observation both teach that in accordance with this defective organization, the Mongol, the Malay, the Indian, and Negro are now, and have been in all ages and places, inferior to the Caucasian. So you could read on with this, but I don't like to read too much of it out loud because I am haunted by it as well. He is a doctor. He's a medical doctor, and he's also a highly respected scholar and published several books that were reprinted in edition after edition. So when we see the mad science that goes on with Hawthorne, how can you look away from eugenics? It's very difficult for me to separate the history from the literary forms. Have you ever thought about Hawthorne and Poe in these contexts?
I don't think specifically, but I guess with Poe, I kind of think about the idea that most horror is kind of based on something that's going on contemporarily, like at the time it's written.
Yeah.
But I mean, that's more of when I think about like, you know, like 70s or 80s or even 90s horror.
Mm-hmm.
Because that's when you get a lot of fear of like the movie Alien. You know, it's that fear of like, you know, a foreign object in you,
Mm-hmm.
like, you know, something
Right.
invading your personal space.
Right. There was a huge nativism movement as well that I think the annexation, first primary document, were supporting nativism, which was not supporting Native Americans, but native-born Americans who were white. There's plenty of black ones, but they didn't count. Where they had a political party, which was kind of similar to some political parties we might have today. But I'm sorry, I interrupted.
No, I mean, I guess from what I remember of Poe, I can kind of see the idea of, especially when you have it on like the cusp of the Civil War, like just starting out,
Mm-hmm.
and slavery being like a thing. It's like, yeah, like it's not. The scariest thing is what people can do to each other, and like, you know, mental illness, and that it's not something that doesn't exist.
Yeah, depraved people. I think many abolitionists argued that slavery itself made owners depraved. Having that amount of power actually made them insane in a way. Poe is better known for being the tomahawk critic, though, because in addition to struggling with his own popularity, he wrote literary reviews and tore everyone else apart. And even, you know, he'd even tear Hawthorne apart. No one, according to Poe, could write halfway decently. So he was very confrontational in his criticism. So he'd write in the New York Literary Magazine a review of Hawthorne and completely like tear him apart, which is interesting because they seem very similar in style. So was that actually the alien within is yourself kind of problem? And I think in this, so you can feel free to look through this document. Here is another pro-slavery document, George Fitzhugh. This is from Sociology for the South, but George Fitzhugh also argued in a book called Cannibals All, which is, the title should tell you something, that not only should black people stay in slavery in the South, but there should be something more like a form of slavery in the North for factory workers, because Irish immigrants were a hot mess, according to him, and needed to be controlled and managed by his kind of talented tenth of wealthy men who should run the world. And, the final one is about the ideal of domesticity and ideal womanhood. Catherine Beecher was what do you call it? When somebody's married to somebody's husband. And sister, do you call it sister-in-law. I'm not well versed in marriage categories, I guess. Catherine Beecher was the sister-in-law of Harriet Beecher Stowe, who was the great anti-slavery writer. But Catherine Beecher was a very conservative writer about women. So she would call herself a women's rights activist because she felt that women should be on a pedestal because they were more Christian and submissive and didn't participate in the ugliness of the world, and because they raised children. So she was very essentialist about women's role and tying it to the domestic and to the home, whereas Stanton had like 10 children that she made other people care for quite a bit and wanted to be in the public, the public eye to gain women's rights. Catherine Beecher was more about the private sphere as the women's sphere. Women coming from the private sphere of the home into the public sphere, which was previously for male writers and male politicians and male voices, was really wreaking havoc on society and culture in that time period. But Catherine Beecher says, "It is to mothers and to teachers that the world is to look for the character which is to be enstamped on each succeeding generation, for it is to them that the great business of education is almost exclusively committed. And will it not appear by examination that neither mothers nor teachers have ever been properly educated for their profession? What is the profession of a woman? Is it not to form immortal minds, and to watch, to nurse, and to rear the bodily system, so fearfully and wonderfully made, and upon the order and regulation of which the health and well-being of the mind so greatly depends?" So she's arguing for women's education, but women need education because they raise children. And the things that she mentions as women's occupation, taking care of the body so much, like changing diapers essentially, not sure why you need education for that, but that's her argument. So she places women very much in that private sphere of the home. So that's just a bit of background and context. Let's talk about the birthmark, because I have it in my head that is what is in the folder for today. But I might be wrong, because my head is a bit of a hurricane. Let's see. No internet connection. Well, how do I have Apple TV?